I found a tube of lubricant in my wife's drawer. I thought it was betrayal until I heard her planning my death with my own son-in-law. So I didn't run. I waited and built a trap that would make them beg for mercy under flashing red lights. The day I found that small silver tube, the world I'd built over 30 years cracked without making a sound. Grace and I had grown into that quiet stage of marriage people call comfortable. We didn't argue much, didn't talk much either. The love was there, like an old photograph, faded, but still visible if you looked long enough. That Friday, I came home early from the hardware store because of a splitting migraine. Her car was in the driveway, sunlight glinting off the hood. I remember thinking how strange it was. She usually spent Fridays out with her yoga friends. Inside, the house smelled of her perfume, something floral and expensive she hadn't worn in years. I called her name once. No answer. I climbed the stairs, the air thick with the kind of silence that hides secrets. Our bedroom looked untouched, perfectly made. But when I went to grab my reading glasses from her side of the dresser, my hand brushed something smooth and foreign. A tube of lubricant. It was new, sleek, high-end, still in its packaging. Grace and I hadn't been intimate in 2 years, not because we stopped loving each other, but because life had quietly pulled the curtains closed on that part of us. She'd said once, "We're just tired, John. That's all." And I'd believed her. But now, as morning light spilled over that dresser, I felt a cold certainty slide into my chest. There were only 2 explanations, and one of them would bury me. I placed the tube back exactly as I found it, every motion precise, like a man defusing a bomb. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, trying to hear the sound of my own heartbeat over the roar in my head. Grace came home later than usual that night, cheeks flushed, smelling faintly of wine and laughter. "You're home early," she said, surprised but quick to recover. "I stopped by with Clara. Her lie was smooth, practiced. We ate dinner together, pot roast and mashed potatoes, the kind of meal she only made when she felt guilty. She asked about my headache 3 times, smiled too brightly, touched my hand like she was trying to remind herself who I was. That night I couldn't sleep. I watched her breathe beside me, steady and peaceful, while my mind unraveled in quiet chaos. I thought of Ethan, my son-in-law, 32, charming, too charming, always dropping by the house when I was supposed to be at work fixing the sprinklers, offering to help out around the yard. Grace said he was just being kind, Clara's husband, a good man. But I'd started to notice the way she laughed at his jokes, how she'd find reasons to linger when he visited, how his truck always left 10 minutes before I came home. The lubricant made sense now. Still, suspicion without proof is just paranoia. I needed truth, hard, undeniable, recorded truth. The next day at lunch, I drove to a small electronics store and bought A voice-activated recorder, the kind that could pick up a whisper from across a room. The clerk smiled. "Recording a lecture, sir." I smiled back. Something like that. That night I kissed Grace on the cheek and told her I'd be working late inventory at the store. She barely looked up from her phone when she said, "Don't stay too late." I parked 3 blocks away, heart thudding like a drumline. The house was dark, except for the glow of the kitchen window. Through it, I saw her moving with purpose, lighting candles, pouring wine, preparing for something. Or someone. I waited. At 7:10 p.m., headlights rolled slowly down the street. A white pickup, Ethan's. He parked across from the house, glancing around like a man who'd done this many times before. When Grace opened the door, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. The kind of smile you save for someone who still makes you feel alive. I didn't move, didn't shout, didn't storm in. I just pressed record. Because sometimes the quietest men aren't the ones who don't feel. They're the ones who already know exactly what they're going to do. The next morning I went through the motions of work like a ghost clocking in. My hands scanned barcodes, signed receipts, greeted customers. But my mind was still in that dark house 3 blocks away, where my wife and my son-in-law were laughing over wine and lies. That night, when Grace was asleep, I slipped out of bed, retrieved the recorder from its hiding place behind the bookshelf, and sat alone in the garage. The air smelled like oil dust and betrayal. For a moment, I just stared at the small red light on the device. My thumb hovered over the play button. Once I pressed it, there would be no going back. I pressed play. The sound of our front door opening filled the room. Grace's voice came first, soft, playful, unfamiliar. "You're late." "Traffic." Ethan replied, his voice deep, relaxed. "You look incredible." I froze. That wasn't small talk. That was intimacy. The conversation flowed easily between them, jokes, laughter, the faint clink of wine glasses. I fast-forwarded, my stomach tightening. Then his voice dropped colder. "Did you call the insurance company?" "I did," Grace said. "$500,000. I'm the sole beneficiary." $500,000. My finger shook. The garage felt smaller, the air heavier. "Good," Ethan said. "He doesn't suspect anything." "John," she laughed lightly. "He thinks I'm just moody. Maybe menopause." He's clueless. The sound of my name from her lips wrapped in mockery felt worse than any insult. "The pills I got from my contact look identical," Ethan continued. "They'll raise his blood pressure slowly. After a few weeks, it'll look natural." "And you're sure it'll work?" 3 months? Maybe 4. At his age, no one will question a heart attack. I hit pause. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear it. They weren't just cheating. They were planning to kill me. For money. I stared at my reflection in the dark window. A man whose entire life had just been reclassified as temporary. The loyalty I'd built, the house I'd worked for, the years I'd given all of it, was just scaffolding around their greed. I pressed play again, forcing myself to listen. 500,000, Grace whispered dreamily. We could finally move to Costa Rica. You, me, the ocean. No more secrets. And your daughter, Ethan asked. Clara's busy with her job. She won't notice. She thinks you're perfect for me. That line burned through me like acid. My daughter, their shield. When I reached the part where they kissed, I ripped the earbuds out and slammed the recorder against the table. I didn't break it. I couldn't. It was my only proof. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the metal shelves and tools that had been part of my quiet life. A screwdriver, a hammer, nails, all built for fixing things. But some things weren't meant to be fixed. At dawn, I returned to the medicine cabinet and checked my pills. They looked the same as always, white, round, harmless. But now I saw poison where I used to see prescription. I flushed every one of them down the toilet, watching them swirl like tiny betrayals disappearing into the dark. Grace stirred as I climbed back into bed. You're up early, she murmured. Couldn't sleep, I said quietly. Bad dreams. You worry too much, John. Yeah, I whispered, I do. When she rolled over, I lay there, staring at the ceiling fan. I realized then that the moment you stop trusting someone you love, every sound in the room becomes suspicious. Every breath feels like a lie. But anger is a fire that burns out quick. What I felt wasn't fire. It was ice. Cold, patient, calculating. Over the next few days, I studied Ethan's routines. He came to our house every Tuesday around 3:00 p.m. when I was supposed to be working late. Always with his white pickup, always confident, always careless. And Grace, she'd started dressing better, wearing perfume, putting on lipstick before he arrived. I watched all of it from a distance, every detail, another nail in the coffin of the life I thought I had. But I wasn't just watching anymore. I was planning. Years in retail had taught me that systems fail when you hit them from the inside. You don't fight chaos with emotion. You fight it with precision. They wanted to kill me quietly, make it look like nature did their dirty work. I was going to return the favor, but in reverse. No blood, no violence, just truth. And when the truth came, it wouldn't whisper. It would scream. That night I sat in the garage again, the recorder beside me like a ticking clock. I wrote everything down. Dates, times, plans. Then I stared at the words 500,000 written in ink. To them it was money. To me it was motive. And in that moment I made a decision. If Grace and Ethan wanted to play with my life, fine. But I was going to write the ending. In my ink. On my terms. The next morning, I watched Ethan from the distance. A man watches a storm that hasn't broken yet. I had seen his patterns, but patterns don't become proof until you follow them. So I called in sick, told my assistant manager I had a fever, and parked 3 blocks from his apartment complex with a thermos of black coffee and the kind of patience you only learn after 55 years of swallowing words instead of throwing punches. At 8:17 a.m., his white pickup rolled out. He wasn't heading to a job site. He was dressed too clean, pressed, shirt cologne visible in the air. I tailed him through morning traffic, 3 cars back, steady, calm. Ethan turned off Dale Mabry Highway into a Publix parking lot. He walked in empty-handed and came out with a small brown grocery bag. Not food for a worker, food for a guest. He drove 10 minutes north and pulled into a gated neighborhood lined with palms, trimmed to perfection. I parked a block away and watched through binoculars I had used for bird watching with Grace years ago. The woman who opened the door looked mid-60s, silver hair cut short, silk robe, money written all over her posture. She smiled the way Grace used to when she was younger, soft, nervous, hopeful. She hugged Ethan like a secret. He carried the grocery bag inside and didn't come out for an hour. When he finally did, his shirt was wrinkled, and his hair looked like he'd just lived out another lie. That was when the anger cooled into something sharper understanding. Ethan wasn't just my daughter's husband or my wife's lover. He was a predator working a system. I followed him through the rest of his route. That day, Hyde Park, West Chase, South Tampa. 3 more houses. 3 more women, all older, all comfortable enough to live behind gates and manicured lawns. Each greeted him with that same quiet thrill, that same fatal mix of loneliness and hope. And each house took about 45 minutes. By noon, I'd watched enough to see the pattern clearly. Ethan Martinez didn't mow lawns. He harvested hearts and bank accounts. I sat in a McDonald's parking lot, scribbling notes on a napkin, like some washed-up detective. 4 women, I wrote. All over 50. Moneyed. All think they're special. Then underlined 1 word. Twice Grace. My wife wasn't unique. She was just another mark. The difference was I was still breathing, and I intended to stay that way. That afternoon, I drove to the first house, the silver-haired woman's. Her name stenciled on the mailbox, Elena Rodriguez. Our neighbor. 3 houses down. She answered in the same robe, surprise flickering into embarrassment. John, is something wrong? I just need to ask you something straight. I said calm, steady. Are you seeing Ethan Martinez? Her eyes widened, then collapsed, under the weight of truth. He told me you wouldn't understand, she whispered. That your family mistreated him. He loves me. Has he asked you for money? Her silence answered before her lips did. When she finally spoke, the words poured out like confession. $15,000 for his struggling business. Help with truck payments, promises of a future in Costa Rica. Same dream, same script. I told her gently what I knew about Grace, about the insurance, about the pills meant for me. She broke down right there in the doorway, crying into trembling hands. Don't blame yourself, I said quietly. He preys on good people. That's what makes it work. By the next day, I had tracked down 2 of the other women, Margaret Chen and Patricia Williams, each with the same story, different numbers. 30,000 from one rent money from another. A new truck gifted by a third who thought she'd found love again at 70. He'd even gotten some of them to change their wills. Every victim was a mirror of my wife, lonely, hopeful yearning to feel young again. And every one of them was paying for the illusion. The realization didn't make me angrier. It made me precise. Because now this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice for Grace's weakness, for my daughter's pain, for every woman Ethan had turned into a punchline. That night, back in my garage, I stared at the tools again. Wood glue, epoxy, industrial sealant. I thought about the irony of it after decades. Fixing broken shelves and shattered tiles, I was about to fix something far bigger. A man who thought he couldn't be caught. I laid out the plan on paper, the way an engineer drafts blueprints, timing placement sequence. Ethan's arrogance was the weak link. He always used my house because it felt safe. He thought he owned my silence. Fine. I'd let him keep it right up until the moment silence became his punishment. Before turning in, I walked into the dark kitchen where Grace was rinsing dishes. She looked up, smiling faintly. "You're quiet tonight." "Just tired," I said. "Long day." She dried her hands and kissed my cheek. Her perfume lingered, expensive, foreign, dishonest. "You worry too much, John." Maybe she was right. I used to worry, but not anymore. Because now, I wasn't the man waiting to die. I was the man designing the moment they'd finally understand what betrayal costs. Plans don't begin with anger. They begin with stillness. That night, after Grace fell asleep, I sat in the garage with the same quiet tools I'd used for years: screwdriver, drill, epoxy, sandpaper. Simple instruments that in the right hands could hold a house together or tear a life apart. I opened my notebook and drew a square for each step: preparation, execution, exposure, aftermath. I didn't want to fight. I wanted truth dragged into daylight where lies can't breathe. Ethan and Grace always met on Tuesdays when I worked late. Their pattern was precise, predictable. They thought comfort made them safe. Comfort only makes you careless. The core of the plan came to me while checking the adhesives aisle at the store. Industrial grade bonding gel, clear, odorless, permanent, until chemically dissolved. We used it for construction projects that needed to hold under pressure. I'd spent decades teaching new hires how to handle it. Never touch skin to skin, I used to say. Once it fuses, it's not coming apart easy. That same night I tested a drop on scrap metal, and within seconds it was solid, stronger than steel, invisible when dry. The idea took shape. If they used intimacy as a weapon, I'd make intimacy their punishment. From there, everything fell into place. I replaced the batteries in the living room smoke detector with a modified version connected to a small remote trigger I built from spare wiring kits. If I pressed the button, the alarm would shriek loud enough to wake the dead or summon the entire neighborhood. Then I paired a Bluetooth speaker behind the couch, preloaded with a recording of panicked voices calling for help. The final step, the switch. Grace always kept that silver tube in her top drawer. I'd seen her reach for it once when she thought I wasn't watching. On Tuesday, when Ethan came, she'd reach for it again. Only this time, it wouldn't be lubricant inside. It would be truth, thick, clear, and permanent. I practiced the timing until it felt like choreography. Step 1. Wait until Ethan's truck arrived. Step 2. Slip into the house through the back door using my spare key. Step 3. Empty the original tube. Refill it with adhesive. Place it back. Step 4. Retreat, trigger the alarm. Let the show unfold. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. The world would see them exactly as they were exposed, raw, inseparable in their guilt. On Monday night, I sat across from Grace at dinner. She was distracted, smiling into her phone. Between bites. Big day tomorrow, I asked. She blinked, pretending to think. Just yoga. Why nothing? I said, just wondering if I should pick up dinner. She shrugged. Maybe. Don't wait up. That was all the confirmation I needed. Tuesday arrived, clear and warm. I called the store and said I'd be working remotely reviewing supply orders. At 3 o'clock, I parked 2 blocks away and waited. Right on time, Ethan's white pickup turned onto our street. He walked up with that easy swagger I'd once mistaken for confidence. He was carrying a bottle of wine. Of course he was. When the front door opened, I saw Grace's silhouette, waiting like a loyal dog for its master. The door closed behind them, sealing their fate. I gave them 30 minutes. Then I moved. The house was quiet, except for soft music upstairs. I slipped inside through the kitchen door, heart-steady movements, mechanical. In our bedroom, the drawer was half open. I emptied the lubricant into the sink, replaced it with adhesive, capped it tightly, and set it back among her silk and lace. Then I crouched beside the couch and connected my phone to the speaker. The smoke detector blinked ready. Everything was perfect. From upstairs came a burst of laughter, my wife's laughter. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to it. It didn't sound like her anymore. Too young, too free. I almost pitied her for thinking love, built on deceit, could last longer than truth. I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me, and returned to my truck. The neighborhood was peaceful. Mrs. Rodriguez watered her garden. Kids played down the street. Nobody knew that within the hour, this street would become a stage. At 4:30, I heard music drift from our bedroom window, faint and rhythmic. I pictured them there laughing, whispering, reaching for that silver tube. My hand hovered over the remote, waiting. 5 minutes later, a shout muffled, frantic. I pressed the button. The smoke alarm screamed to life. Then the pre-recorded voices began. Help, fire. We're trapped. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez dropped her hose. Oh my God, John and Grace's house. Neighbors ran out calling 911. Within minutes, sirens echoed down the block. Fire trucks, ambulances, and leading them, my daughter Clara. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd come to save her mother and husband, but what she'd find upstairs would save her instead. Because sometimes the only way to reveal evil is to let it expose itself. Sirens sliced through the quiet Tampa afternoon like a blade. Neighbors poured out of their houses, faces tilted upward toward mine, their voices colliding into a single question. Is the Miller's house on fire? From where I sat in my truck, I could see everything. The blinking red light from the smoke alarm behind my living room curtain, the open bedroom window upstairs, the faint sounds that followed the panic I'd engineered. Wait, something's wrong. It's burning. What is this? Grace's voice was sharp, high, terrified. Ethan's was deeper, desperate. The sound of struggle carried through the walls. We can't move. What the hell did you use? It was just the same one. The same tube. No, it's not. We're stuck. Grace, we're stuck. I could hear every word through that open window. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just listened. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance being restored. The Bluetooth speaker came alive inside the house. My pre-recorded voices echoed through the air. Help, fire. We're trapped, please. Help. The sound mixed with the shrill alarm, creating a chorus of chaos. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor, one of Ethan's other victims, dropped her garden hose and screamed. Oh my God, John's house. Call 911. Within moments, the entire block was buzzing with confusion. People pointed, shouted, called emergency numbers. Sirens grew louder. Red lights washed over the street. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cruisers. And then, in the front of the convoy, the white and blue rescue unit, with Clara's badge on the side. My daughter, my only child, the one person whose world I was about to destroy and save. She jumped out of the ambulance, helmet in hand, barking orders with the precision of a seasoned paramedic. What do we have? She shouted. Possible structure fire. 2 people trapped inside, one of the neighbors yelled back. Clara turned to her team. Entry through the front door. Move. The firefighters lifted their axes, slamming against the frame. Wood splintered. Screws screamed. The door flew open. Smoke alarm blaring. Artificial screams echoing. But no real fire. Only the heat of humiliation waiting upstairs. I stepped out of my truck, moving closer, blending into the crowd of onlookers gathering along the lawn. I had practiced this moment in my head, every detail. Rehearsed the look of confusion, the shake of my hands, the performance of a husband coming home to a nightmare. Clara disappeared into the house with her team. I watched the tension in her shoulders as she moved through the rooms, she'd grown up in now, filled with false smoke and real sin. "Upstairs," she called. Her voices better. Seconds later, a scream. Not the recording this time. Real. The kind of scream that collapses a lifetime in one breath. Clara's voice followed, trembling but professional. "I need acetone adhesive remover and trauma sheets now." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Whispers rippled through them. What's going on in there? Is everyone okay? Why would they need acetone? When the door finally opened, again Clara stepped out first. Her face was pale, eyes empty. Behind her, two paramedics rolled a covered with a white sheet. The crowd leaned forward, gasping, when they saw the man beneath it, Ethan. He was conscious, but his face was crimson. His expression shattered. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He tried to cover himself, but the sheet barely held. The adhesive had burned red patches across his skin. Someone in the crowd recognized him. "Isn't that Clara's husband?" Then the second stretcher came out. Grace, my wife, wrapped in another white sheet, sobbing, clutching her face in shame. The crowd erupted in whispers. Phones lifted, cameras clicked. The internet would have its story by sundown. Mrs. Rodriguez gasped aloud, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "That's him. That's the man who—" She stopped herself, tears filling her eyes. I stepped forward, like a man walking through fog. My face, a mask of disbelief. "Grace," I said softly. "What happened?" She didn't look up. Couldn't. Clara turned toward me, shaking voice low. "Dad, I don't understand. I found them. Together." She swallowed hard, unable to finish. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. "You did what you had to, sweetheart. You saved them." But deep down, I knew the opposite was true. She hadn't saved them. She'd revealed them. As the ambulances pulled away, sirens fading into distance, I stood on the front lawn, surrounded by neighbors and flashing lights. Every face looked at me with pity, some with admiration. 30 years of marriage," Mr. Chen muttered. "What a shame." Poor John, Mrs. Williams said. He didn't deserve this. They were right. But what none of them knew was that I hadn't lost anything that day. I'd reclaimed it. That night, as the neighborhood returned to uneasy quiet, I sat on the porch under the same stars that had watched over my downfall and resurrection. The air smelled faintly of smoke and justice. Grace was on her way to the hospital. Ethan, too. And I knew I wasn't finished. Because exposing them wasn't the end. It was only part one of their education in pain. Hospitals have a way of muting everything sound, light, even guilt. The next evening, I sat in the waiting area of Tampa General, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rhythm of beeping monitors. I'd come here to play a part, the broken husband, the grieving father, the man trying to understand what had just destroyed his family. Clara was still in uniform, sitting beside me. Her face looked 10 years older than the night before. She kept rubbing her hands together, whispering, "I can't unsee it, Dad. I just can't." I squeezed her shoulder. gently. You did your job, sweetheart. That's all anyone could have asked. She nodded, eyes hollow. They're keeping both of them overnight. Separate rooms. Separate. I repeated softly. That's new for them. When the nurse called our name, Clara and I followed her down the corridor. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and something colder, shame, maybe. Room 214, Grace Miller. The door was half open. Grace was lying in bed, her face pale, her hands trembling. When she saw me, she started to cry. John, I'm sorry. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to, I said, closing the door behind me. I just wanted to see if you're all right. Her voice was small. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He told me we'd be free, that we'd have money, peace. I thought I stopped her with a quiet gesture. You thought killing me would fix your loneliness? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. A nurse entered. Young, tired, efficient. Mrs. Miller, the doctor, prescribed this topical gel for the adhesive burns. Apply it twice daily. It'll help with the inflammation. Thank you, Grace whispered, setting the tube on her bedside table. The nurse left. I looked at the small silver tube. Familiar shape. Familiar lie. I'll let you rest, I said softly. Stepping closer. We'll talk later. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back just slightly enough for her to feel the distance she'd created. Out in the hallway, Clara was waiting. How's Mom guilty? I said. And alive. She nodded without meeting my eyes. Room 216 is Ethan's. The police are watching him until they finish the report. Good, I said. Let's check on him. We walked the short distance, the floor squeaking beneath our shoes. Room 216 was brighter, more sterile. Ethan was awake, staring at his phone, his arm bandaged. When he saw me, his expression twisted into something between guilt and fear. John, Mr. Miller, look. I don't even know where to start. It wasn't supposed to. I held up a hand. Save it. I'm not here for excuses. He swallowed hard. It just happened. Me and Grace. It wasn't about money. It was love. I interrupted, the word sharp as glass. You loved my wife while you plotted to poison me. His jaw clenched, but his eyes darted away. I made mistakes. No, I said quietly. You made choices. Right then the nurse came in, same routine. Same silver tube. Mr. Martinez, here's your healing gel. Apply it sparingly to any irritated areas. He nodded mutely, placing it on the tray beside him. The nurse left. I stayed a few minutes longer, pretending to struggle with forgiveness. Then I sighed and stood. I need air, I said. This is a lot to process. I stepped out of his room and down the hallway until I found a small supply closet. The sign read, Authorized Personnel Only. I slipped inside anyway. Under my jacket, I carried 2 small tubes I had prepared the night before, identical in size and color to the ones the hospital used. Only mine weren't filled with healing gel. They were filled with industrial-strength capsaicin cream, the same chemical used in pest deterrents and bear spray. It wouldn't scar them. It wouldn't kill them. But when applied to raw, irritated skin, it would burn like a message from hell itself. I waited 10 minutes for the hallway to clear, then walked back to Grace's room. She was half asleep. The tube sat untouched on her bedside table. Quietly, I switched it for mine. I stood there a moment, looking at her, the woman who had once promised forever. "You'll feel the fire you wanted for me," I whispered, "just not where you expected." Then I went to Ethan's room. He was half asleep too, eyes heavy, face pale. The nurse's tube still sat on the tray. I switched his as well. By the time I returned to the waiting area, my pulse was steady again. Clara looked up. "You all right?" "As all right as a man can be," I said. "How about you?" "I just want to go home," she murmured. "Soon, I promised." Very soon. 30 minutes later, it began. From down the hall came a sharp scream. Grace's voice raw and rising, then another deeper, angrier, Ethan's. Nurses ran past us, shouting, "Get milk, get oil. It's chemical burns." I rose slowly, keeping my expression blank. Clara jumped to her feet, panicked. "That's Mom. What's happening?" Maybe I said quietly, "It's just the consequences catching up." As the alarms blared again and medical staff flooded the corridor, I stood in the chaos I'd created, calm, silent, invisible. Because justice, when done right, doesn't scream. It burns. The screaming stopped after 20 minutes, replaced by the low hum of chaos. Nurses moved in and out of rooms. Doctors shouted orders, and the air smelled like antiseptic and burnt rubber. I stood in the hallway beside Clara, watching the rush of white coats and blue scrubs blur past like waves. "They're both stable," one nurse said breathlessly to another. "It wasn't an allergic reaction. It's capsaicin industrial grade." Clara blinked in disbelief. "Capsaicin like pepper spray?" The nurse nodded. "Stronger. We've never seen anything like it in a hospital context." Clara turned toward me, confusion clouding her face. "Who would do something like that?" I just looked at the floor. Sometimes people bring pain on themselves. Before she could answer, the elevator doors slid open with a chime. A familiar figure stepped out. Elena Rodriguez, wrapped in a shawl, her silver hair, disheveled eyes wide and trembling. She spotted me immediately. "John," she called, her voice echoing down the hallway. "I need to talk to you right now." Clara frowned. "Miss Rodriguez, what are you doing here?" Elena clutched her purse like it was a life raft. "Because this isn't just about you, Clara. It's about what that man did to all of us." Her words stopped every conversation around us. Even the nurses slowed, sensing something heavy in the air. "What do you mean?" Clara asked carefully. Elena turned toward Ethan's room, her voice shaking with rage. "That monster, your husband, has been lying to everyone. To me, to your mother, to half the women in this city. He took our money, our trust, our dignity. He told us all the same story, the struggling business, the big future, the new life in Costa Rica. We were all his targets. Clara's lips parted in shock. That's impossible. It's true. Another voice said. I turned. 2 women were walking down the hall. Margaret Chen and Patricia Williams. Both older, both angry, both holding folders and papers like weapons. Elena gestured to them. Margaret gave him $30,000. Patricia paid his rent for almost a year. I gave him $15,000 myself. He said we were his only ones. Patricia's voice cracked. He promised to marry me. He even made me change my will. A nurse paused, staring at them. Wait, you were involved with Ethan Martinez. Elena nodded fiercely. He's a con artist, a professional. He seduced older women for money. And when he found out Grace Miller had a husband with a life insurance policy, she glanced at me. He saw an opportunity. Clara's face drained of color. You're saying he used my mother. I placed a steady hand on her shoulder. He used everyone. For a moment, the hallway was silent, except for the faint beeping of machines. Then Ethan's voice cut through the quiet, hoarse defensive from behind his hospital door. That's a lie. They all gave me that money willingly. Elena's eyes blazed. You said you loved me. You said we'd start over in Costa Rica. The door burst open and Ethan appeared wrapped in a hospital gown, skin red and blistered, but pride still clinging to him like a bad smell. You're all insane. I was trying to help. I'm a businessman. Margaret held up a stack of documents. You mean this business license that expired 2 years ago? The one with no tax filings? You're a thief and a liar. And Ethan tried to speak, but the words came out broken. You can't prove anything. That was when Detective Morrison arrived. A tall man in his 50s with a mustache, a weary face, and the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. He flashed his badge, the hallway falling instantly quiet. Mr. Ethan Martinez, he said calmly, I think we can prove plenty. The detective nodded to an officer who handed him a small plastic bag, my digital recorder. I'd dropped it off anonymously that morning at the precinct with a short note for your investigation. Morrison pressed play. Grace's voice came through first, soft and breathless. Did you call the insurance company $500,000? Ethan answered. He'll never see it coming. The crowd froze. The hallway seemed to shrink around the sound of those words. Clara's hand covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Detective Morrison looked up at Ethan. You want to explain that? Ethan stammered. That was a joke. No, Morrison said quietly. That was conspiracy to commit murder. He gestured to the officer beside him. Cuff him. As the handcuffs clicked, Ethan winced, both from the metal and the burns beneath it. You set me up. Oh, he spat toward me. You think you're some kind of hero. I met his eyes steady. No, just a man cleaning up his house. 2 rooms down, Grace began crying loudly. Realizing the sound of her own voice on that recording, meant her part was no secret either. Detective Morrison turned to the nurse. Place Mrs. Miller under arrest as well, conspiracy and insurance fraud. The nurse hesitated. But she's injured. So were his victims, the detective replied. As officers led Ethan down the hallway, the women he'd conned stepped aside not with pity, but with satisfaction. Elena crossed her arms and whispered, "Burn in your own lies." Clara stood frozen, beside me shaking. "Yeah, Dad, how did you even know to record them?" I smiled faintly, keeping my voice low. I didn't. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was God. Maybe the truth just wanted to be heard. She believed me. Everyone did. And as they led Ethan away, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not joy, not triumph. Peace. Because justice doesn't always come from the court. Sometimes it comes from the quiet hands of a man everyone thought was already defeated. 2 days later, Tampa woke up to the story splashed across every screen. Paramedic's husband arrested in murder for insurance plot. Headlines carried my name, Grace's name, Clara's title, and Ethan's mugshot, eyes swollen, face burned, pride broken. The police had taken them both the night before. Ethan for conspiracy and fraud. Grace for aiding and abetting. Every network played the same clip, officers leading Ethan through hospital corridors, handcuffs biting into bandaged wrists. His face wasn't angry. It was empty, the look of a man who realized too late that he'd been outplayed by someone he underestimated. The phone rang all morning. Neighbors, reporters, even the church called. Everyone wanted the same thing. A quote, a statement, a reaction. I gave them silence. Clara stayed with me that day. She barely spoke, still processing the avalanche of truth that had fallen on her life. The newspapers called her the daughter who saved the victims. If only they knew she'd saved something far bigger, her own soul, from the rot her husband tried to drag her into. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Grace used to decorate with flowers. Now it was bare, except for 2 cups of cold coffee. Clara broke the silence. I still can't believe she did that. Mom, she lost herself somewhere along the way, I said softly. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe greed. Sometimes it's both. Her eyes filled. She said she loved him. She loved the escape, I corrected gently. He just happened to be standing by the door. She stared at her hands. And you're just okay with this? Okay. I leaned back, letting the word hang. No. But I've made peace with what can't be fixed. Outside the street was quiet again. The same houses, the same trimmed lawns, but now every curtain twitched when I walked by. In one afternoon, I had gone from the man everyone nodded politely to the man whose silence made them uneasy. In the afternoon, Detective Morrison came by for a final statement. He removed his hat before stepping into the house, as if entering a church. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice even. "You've been through a hell of a storm." "Storms pass," I said. "They also wash things clean." He sat across from me, flipping open his notebook. "I have to ask, that recording you sent, how you get it?" "Old instincts," I replied. "You live with someone long enough, you start hearing what they don't say." He smiled faintly. "You're either the luckiest man alive or the most calculating." I shrugged. "Maybe both." He nodded slowly. "We'll be pushing for a full conviction. You might be called to testify." "I'll be there," I said. He stood, hesitating. "One more thing, those burns they got. Doctors said it looked like a chemical mix, not standard hospital cream. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I met his eyes, calm, unwavering. "Detective, I sell hardware, not medicine." He studied me for a long moment, then closed his notebook. "Right. Well, stay safe, Mr. Miller." When he left, I watched his car fade down the street. I knew he suspected something. But suspicion without proof is just wind. And wind, like rumors, dies out eventually. That night, the city's noise returned. Sirens, television chatter. But inside my house, there was peace. I walked through every room, touching the furniture. Grace once polished the photographs Clara once hung. Every corner whispered echoes of what used to be, but I didn't feel grief, just distance. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the lawn where the fire trucks had once parked. The same patch of grass where truth had finally burned its way into daylight. Sometimes people say, justice is blind. They're wrong. Justice just waits, quietly, patiently, until someone brave enough opens their eyes. 2 days later, Clara handed me a letter from the police Grace had confessed. She'd told them everything. The pills, the plan, the affair. Said she'd been manipulated. That she'd lost her mind. That Ethan made her believe I didn't love her anymore. I read the statement without blinking. "Did she mention remorse?" I asked. "Some," Clara said. "She said she deserved whatever's coming." I folded the paper neatly. Then maybe for once, she's right. Ethan, on the other hand, refused to talk. His lawyer tried to spin it temporary insanity, emotional coercion, self-defense. But the evidence was solid. The restrainings, the money transfers, the testimonies of the other women. The case would go to trial in a few months, but the verdict was already written in the court of public opinion. I poured myself a glass of bourbon that night first, in months, and sat outside on the porch. The same chair I'd built years ago, the same spot where I used to watch the sunset with Grace. I raised the glass slightly, a silent toast to the life that had ended without a funeral. Across the street, the Rodriguez house lights flicked on. She saw me through the window, raised her hand, nodded once. A small gesture between two survivors. Maybe she found peace in seeing justice served. Maybe I did too. But deep down, I knew something Clara didn't. Something the world would never know. That justice, the kind that truly heals, never leaves fingerprints. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, that faint smell of stale coffee, and truth reluctantly unfolding. I took my seat near the back, the same row where silent witnesses always sit, not seeking attention, just closure. The trial had drawn a crowd. Local reporters filled the benches. Neighbors whispered behind cupped hands. Clara sat beside me, her uniform-pressed face expressionless. She hadn't visited her mother since the arrest. I didn't blame her. Some betrayals burn too deep to touch again. When Ethan entered in his orange jumpsuit, the room stirred. The swagger that once filled every space he walked into was gone. His shoulders slumped, eyes darting nervously. He looked for me once, searching for the same control we'd lost the moment the cuffs clicked. I didn't look away, but I didn't look at him either. Just through him. Grace followed next, escorted by 2 officers. She looked smaller, older. The glow that once masked her lies had faded, replaced by the gray pallor of regret. For the first time, I couldn't read her face. It wasn't sorrow or anger, just vacancy. Judge Reynolds called the court to order. The charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder insurance, fraud, criminal coercion, and aggravated battery. Words heavy enough to silence even the gossipers in the back row. The prosecution played the recording again. I didn't need to hear it. I could recite every word from memory. But watching it echo through the courtroom, my wife's voice calm and cruel was like watching ghosts perform my eulogy. $500,000. I'm the sole beneficiary. 3 months, maybe 4. At his age, no one will question a heart attack. Some in the courtroom gasped, others just stared at me with that look pity wrapped in admiration. The look people give survivors when they don't understand how survival feels. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, his lawyer coached him through a plea. He said he was manipulated, pressured, emotionally unstable. That Grace convinced him it was the only way to secure their future. That he was the victim of her loneliness. Grace's attorney countered with the opposite story. Ethan had brainwashed her, promised love, freedom, a new life. Told her I was abusive, controlling. She wept during testimony, clutching tissues like prayer beads. I listened to every word and believed none of it. Truth doesn't live in tears. It lives in choices. When the jury finally recessed, the air in the courtroom felt heavy enough to taste. I went outside for air, standing by the marble steps, watching people hurry by with their coffees and small talk, blissfully unaware that some lives end quietly in rooms like these, without blood, without funerals. By the end of the week, the verdict came. 12 people who didn't know me had decided my fate anyway. Ethan Martinez guilty on all counts. 28 years in state prison. No parole for 15. Grace Miller guilty of conspiracy and insurance fraud. 7 years reduced to 5 with good behavior. The gavel fell like a final heartbeat. Reporters surrounded me outside the courthouse. Mr. Miller, any statement for the victims? Do you forgive your wife? What do you feel now that justice is served? I looked at the microphones, the flashing cameras, the faces, hungry for sound bites, and said the only true thing left to say, I feel nothing. Because justice doesn't fill the hole betrayal leaves. It just stops it from growing. That night, I returned home alone. The house was silent. Again, not the kind of silence that suffocates, but the kind that finally exhales. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon and stood at the window, the reflection of flashing cameras still faintly haunting the glass. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez's porch light was on. She waved once. I nodded back. Some survivors share the same quiet language. I thought about Ethan in his cell, about Grace folding prison linens, about Clara finally sleeping through the night. Everyone was where they belonged. I should have felt victorious. But victory is loud, and I had grown used to peace. When I went to bed, I left the lights off. The moonlight spilled across the floorboards, tracing every scar of the past few months, the faint burn marks near the door, the dents from the firemen's axes, the ghosts of a life that used to be mine. And as I drifted towards sleep, one thought anchored me. Justice isn't about winning. It's about knowing when not to strike again. It's been 3 months since the trial ended. The cameras moved on. The neighbors stopped whispering. Even the weeds that grew through the cracks of the front walkway seemed tired of remembering. I wake up early these days out of habit, not necessity. The house feels different in the morning now, lighter, almost like it's breathing again. No more perfume hanging in the air. No more second pair of footsteps on the stairs. Just silence. And for the first time in years, that silence feels like peace, not punishment. Clara visits on Sundays. We don't talk about her mother, or about Ethan, or about the day the sirens came. We talk about small things, her patience, the weather, the way the sunset hits the backyard fence. Sometimes that's all healing needs. Ordinary words after extraordinary pain. People ask if I forgave Grace. The truth, forgiveness isn't something you hand out like spare change. It's something you grow into slowly, painfully. Some days I think I'm close. Other days, I remember the sound of her voice on that recording, and I realize forgiveness isn't about her at all. It's about freeing myself from the version of me she betrayed. As for Ethan, I don't hate him anymore. Hate ties you to what hurt you. I simply let him exist where he belongs, far away, behind bars, swallowed by the echoes of his own making. Sometimes late at night, I walk past the mirror in the hallway and barely recognize the man looking back. His eyes are quieter, older, but there's something steady in them now. A man who's seen how fragile loyalty is and how strong silence can be. Justice didn't come with applause. It came in stillness, the same kind of stillness that follows a storm. And maybe that's all stoic peace ever is, not the absence of pain, but the mastery of it. I close the door each night and whisper a small prayer, not for Grace, not for Ethan, but for myself. May I never lose kindness, even when I've seen what cruelty looks like up close. Because that's the real victory. Not revenge, not headlines, just the quiet dignity of surviving without bitterness. And if there's one lesson I'll leave behind, it's this: sometimes the loudest justice is silence. From the quiet world of John Miller's stories of betrayal, justice, and the calm that follows chaos. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to Voices of Uncle John, where every scar tells a truth and every silence holds a lesson.